There's no sound on Earth quite like a bird flying into a sliding glass door. Unlike the white noise of mass extinctions and vanishing rainforests, the singular thud of delicate avian bones against shatter-resistant Duraplex glass is impossible to ignore. It's the sound of the natural and man-made worlds colliding, like the off-key fervor of a bronze temple gong struck by a fresh-faced initiate. Tom Avery was savoring his second sip of morning coffee when that one-of-a-kind thud suddenly jolted him from his morning reverie with unduly alarm. The simmering brown liquid abruptly spilled from his toppling teacup onto his pant leg, stinging his left thigh. He swore under his breath and shuffled to the kitchen sink, attempting to pat his pants dry with a dirty dishcloth. After a few unsuccessful attempts to eradicate the stain, he surrendered himself to the ugly smudge and meandered into the living room to investigate the noise that had unwantingly disturbed him. Ambling across his plush woolen carpet, he mentally congratulated himself on his deliberately benign work-life balance. It was nearly Christmas, and a few nights previous, he had finally finished some last-minute skimming of manuscripts online. He wouldn't need to log on for any new work assignments or updates until the next week at the earliest. He'd even left his phone uncharged on the bedside table to celebrate the quiet sanctity of the season. As far as Tom was concerned, the best week of the year was the last 7 days of December. It was the time of year that was always a dead zone for his editing career, which meant he could, in good conscience, gorge on all the holiday sweets he wanted, binge Netflix for hours, and wear sweatpants all day without any judgment from the people in his life who had real jobs, because they'd all be doing the same thing. As Tom reached the sliding glass door, he glanced through it, looking for any signs of potential damage. He hadn't expected to find any, and was surprised to see a single feather stuck to the glass. It was dusty gray, almost white, and about the size of a pinky fingernail. It fluttered lightly in the morning breeze, somehow cemented on the glass about 6 inches below eye level. Tom looked down to see the owner of the feather, and then shook his head. A fist-sized bird lay limp, his twig legs wilted like damp curly fries next to the faded E at the end of the rust-colored welcome mat. While he realized most people didn't have welcome mats in their backyard, he also knew that most people didn't live on the outskirts of the country either. Tom found doormats at every entrance especially useful, particularly in light of the fact that tiny feet and muddy footprints often crossed his threshold. As he surveyed the helpless lump on the cold earth before him, a flutter of motion suddenly caught his eye. "He's alive," Tom breathed. He flicked up the lock on his door and quickly slid it open. The icy chill of morning wafted in with an unwelcome whoosh. The bird, a common sparrow, or finch, Tom could never tell the difference, was dazed, but obviously still intact. His wings fluttered slightly as the fragile creature tried to motivate itself back to some measure of movement. Despite his ornithological shortcomings, Tom quickly concluded that the bird was in dire straits and would likely require some Avery attention if it hoped to survive its predicament. Having made this preliminary decision, Tom sprang into action. He dashed back into the kitchen to grab the coffee-stained hand towel on the countertop. When he returned, the bird had somehow managed to flutter itself all the way over to the W, but didn't look as if it was ready to leave the doormat anytime soon. Even this meager pilgrimage had left it utterly exhausted. His cotton ball chest puffed and deflated in spastic panic, yet the bird was unable to muster the energy to evade what he must have assumed was his imminent death, as Tom's hand slowly descended to pick it up. Working carefully with the kitchen towel, he gently wrapped the delicate bundle around the featherweight body until the bird had settled upright in his palm. One toothpick-sharp foot kicked feebly as the bird struggled to readjust itself in his swaddled prison. Tom shifted the bundle, carefully peeling back the fabric to check on his panicked passenger. He immediately noticed that its frail frame was still hyperventilating in a noble attempt to cram in as many last breaths as possible before its hypothetical demise ensued. Millions of years of evolution unleashed a deluge of adrenaline to every cell in its tiny little body, warning him that each harried breath would likely be his last. Aside from this existential dread, the bird looked surprisingly unharmed. There now, Birdie," Tom cooed. "You'll be all right. We'll fix you up. he promised, and covered his patient carefully with a towel once more. "You just need a little jounce and jolt to start your day," he cooed, his diagnosis singing through the air with a hint of merry exuberance. The bird was in no position to ask for a second opinion, as Tom walked into the kitchen to administer his own personal, yet heretofore undisclosed version of avian first aid. Decades prior to this serendipitous moment, Tom had learned a fair bit about avian care from his grandmother Flo, who raised a quantifiable number of chickens on her farm in Pennsylvania. As kids, he and his brother had loved to feed and chase her birds across the yard, without much regard for the potential mishaps or the inflexible laws of nature. Despite the apparent risk that two unruly boys presented to an animal a tenth of their size, the chickens were surprisingly capable, evading the grasping hands of the two Avery boys with practiced ease. But one afternoon, just as the sun had disappeared behind a billowy collection of fluffy clouds, the younger of the two boys managed to snatch a sleepy, unobservant chicken who had fallen to daydreaming. Not too many moments later, Tom had burst into his grandmother's kitchen, tears plowing crooked rows through the dust and dirt on his young cheeks. He didn't even need to ask for help. He just pointed outside, and his grandmother instinctively knew. She rushed out the door faster than a falcon and assessed the emergency with a measured glance, disappearing back inside only long enough to retrieve an old army surplus blanket from the closet. When she came back outdoors, she corralled the injured chicken like a toreador, carefully carrying the feeble captive inside, bundled tail feathers poking out of the blanket like frozen fireworks. She then marched into the kitchen, turned on the faucet, and dunked the bird upside down under the freezing tap water for a few miserable frigid seconds. Once the bird had gotten a chance to shake itself dry, Grandma fed it a spoonful of American corn whiskey and set it outdoors on the back porch to recuperate. Tom looked down now at the bundle he had wrapped snugly in the kitchen towel. The bird reminded him of an awkwardly shaped Christmas gift that had been clumsily packaged by a loving, albeit inexperienced child. He began to carefully unwrap it. He realized that the first step of his Avery regimen was complete, but he was understandably nervous about step 2. Giving a bird a bath can be quite challenging, especially when that bird is the size of a golf ball and you're clutching it in a coffee-soaked kitchen towel. But his grandma had been quite certain about the necessity of shocking a bird back to health with cold water after a traumatic event. "Birds," she said, "like a couple young boys I know, need a good shock to the system when they're acting like fools." He remembered the wink she'd given him, and the hint of a smile in one corner of her mouth that had dried his tears in an instant, making him feel that things would soon be all right again. With the towel sufficiently loosed, Tom turned on the faucet and slightly loosened his grip on the tiny patient. He checked the temperature of the water with his pinky finger. Ice cold. Keeping his hands cupped, he carefully lowered the bird, dunking him beneath the trickle of tap water. After what can only be described as 5 seconds of waterboarding, Tom determined that his patient had been sufficiently shocked enough to be on the mend. He swaddled him back in the kitchen towel and gently patted him dry. The bird shook his head to rid himself of the string of water droplets. "Now, for the third and final step of the healing process," Tom announced. He opened the wooden cabinet above the stove and stood on his tiptoes to look inside. "I've got just the thing to put a little pep in your step," Tom whispered to the damp bird. "There it is," he crooned, and grabbed a bottle near the very back of the cupboard. "Straight Kentucky bourbon." Tom wedged the whiskey bottle between his thighs and twisted the sticky cap loose with his free hand. The only problem now was calculating the proper dosage for his little patient. A sparrow, or finch, he conceded mentally, is a lot smaller than a chicken, after all. He opened the silverware drawer, searching for the smallest teaspoon he owned. With a bit of jostling, he finally found it, a tarnished scallop-shaped sugar spoon, inherited from his own grandmother. "Well, I'll be," he said wistfully. He took it as a sign that things were moving in the right direction, and laid it on the counter. Balancing his patient in one palm and the bourbon in the other, Tom poured a dram of whiskey for the bird, then took a quick swig of the medicine for himself. Bird doctoring was hard work this early in the morning. He put the bottle down with a clang and tipped his patient toward the life-saving concoction, clutching the towel-wrapped bundle with both hands. Tom then lowered his face down towards the edge of the counter to watch the action. Would the bird actually drink any of the whiskey? He wondered. And how much whiskey did it take to get a finch, or sparrow, drunk? The puffy feathered head of the bird tipped curiously for a moment, before dipping low towards the brown liquid that rested on the spoon. His toy beak opened slightly, and with a quick twitch of the head, he flicked a few sips into his mouth. "You're doing it!" Tom whispered. The bird looked about for a few short seconds, and then nipped a few more sips. And not long after that, a few more. Tom quickly pulled the bird away from the medicinal remedy, taking care to prevent any unnecessary overdosing. Then, he lifted the bird up to eye level for a final inspection. "Looks like you're feeling a bit more chipper," Tom laughed. The bird rotated its head in what Tom could only interpret as a genial drunk's easy agreement. He pondered whether to give the bird another quick dip in the sink to sober him up, but settled upon a gentler regimen of pacing the kitchen for a time, with the bird cradled safely against his chest. Reflecting on the whole ordeal that had coincidentally been dropped on his back doorstep, he suddenly realized he'd done it. He'd helped this tiny, vulnerable wisp of a creature survive against the odds. He'd saved it from an almost certain death. A subtle euphoria buzzed in his brain as an inexplicable surge of Christmas spirit stirred within him. He rocked the bird gently, humming a merry Christmas tune, contemplating a number of inexplicable ideas that had something to do with serendipity and fate, and the myriad of experiences that had brought him to this fleeting yet unforgettable moment. "Maybe I'll write a little story about you," he whispered to the bird. "I'll call it, On Wings of Christmas. You'll be the monumental hero. Small bird makes headlines, survives death-defying crash. We'll tell the world all about you, how it feels to fall down and how uncomfortable it feels to get found sometimes or even get up. Maybe we'll remind them to take heart, that all you need is a little bit of love and luck and a healthy dose of Christmas spirit to get you back on your feet and feeling good again. Yep, I can feel it developing already. It's a good year, bird," he breathed as he paced about the room. "It's a good year." Tom felt the tiny creature flutter in his fingertips. The bird was clearly struggling, attempting to flap against the grip that had gradually tightened a bit too firmly. "Oh, sorry," Tom sputtered. "Let's get you back out there." The bird chirped its impatient agreement. Tom walked back to the living room and opened the sliding glass door. The little gray feather was still stuck to the glass. He gently lowered his patient to the ground, unwrapping the towel like the last anticipated gift of the season. The bird rolled to one side, righting himself with a quick burst of wing beats. He cocked his head and puffed his feathers against the sudden drop in temperature. The morning air was still brisk, even though the sun was starting to burn through the thin, wispy clouds. It was going to be a crisp, clear day. Tom crouched on his heels, his arms wrapped around his knees. He watched the bird test his strength with a few exploratory wing beats. Then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, the bird leapt upwards in a whir of motion, plummeting and dipping, before finally vanishing like a brisk winter breeze into the surreal yet familiar safety of the skies. Tom picked up the dirty kitchen towel and gave it a shake. He closed the sliding glass door with a whoosh and walked back to the kitchen, rubbing his arms to ward off the cold. His coffee had gotten cold, and the kitchen counter smelled like whiskey. He wiped it with the towel and popped his coffee mug in the microwave. Then he stared out the kitchen window, looking for sparrows. Or was it finches? He could never tell the difference.